Vroom, vroom, vroom. Let's go back to my room. It's episode 9 of Good Intentions. Finally a racing game. Excitebike wasn't the first racer Nintendo developed for its 8-bit home console, but it was the first one that mattered. About a month prior to Excitebike's Japanese release date of November 30th, 1984, Nintendo published its very first Famicom racer, and, to my knowledge, the first racing game the company had ever produced. That release, bearing the exciting title of F1 Race, did precisely what it said on the box. It brought Formula One racing to Famicom. Generally speaking, it took the same basic approach to the sport as Namco's pole position, with a behind-the-car camera and shifting scenery. Technically, it looked pretty impressive for a first-generation Famicom title on a basic in-ROM chip, which probably come as no surprise given that HAL and programming genius Satoru Iwata lent a hand to its production. Nintendo's F1 Race rounded out the release schedule and fleshed out the roster of game genres available on Famicom. It didn't exactly break new ground though, and F1 Race would remain stranded in Japan along with a handful of other first-party Famicom titles like Devil World and assorted Japan-focused board games for a reason. It wasn't going to set anyone's world on fire in the US. Besides, by the time NES launched in the US, Nintendo already had a much more inventive and engaging racer to offer up in the form of Excitebike. Designed by Donkey Kong creator Shigeru Miyamoto, Excitebike feels like a quintessential Miyamoto work. That is, the design of the game appears to have emerged less from any notion of how to make a better, more impressive racer, and more from the question of what kind of racer would work best on the hardware. Miyamoto arrived at the conclusion that a standard top-down or over-the-cockpit view would be less suited to the NES than a side-scrolling racer, despite the fact that very few developers had ever attempted to create such a thing. As far as precedents go, Excitebike didn't have very many. Activision had published Grand Prix for Atari 2600 back in 1982, but that was more of a top-down vertical racer turned sideways. Excitebike used a forced three-quarters perspective that made it as much a platformer as a racing game, which means it probably falls closer conceptually to Irem's Moon Patrol than to a racer. In short, Excitebike played almost unlike anything that came before it. Yes, it involved racing, but not the way most gamers had come to expect racing to work, as its artificial perspective allowed for side-scrolling movement, lateral shifts across lanes, and a heavy element of verticality. Excitebike's innovative design almost certainly came about as a response to the technological limits of the NES hardware. The NES processor supported scrolling as a basic feature, which was a big plus at the time. Contemporary consoles and computers like the ColecoVision, Sega's SG-1000, the MSX, and the PC-8801 lacked that ability, and the smooth scrolling of the NES gave it a strong advantage at the time of its Japanese debut. My admittedly incomplete understanding of the NES hardware, based on both remarks by hardware designer Masayuki Uemura and various online technical documents that I've dug up, is that while the system could inherently handle either horizontal or vertical scrolling, it could only manage one of those at a time until special enhancement chips came along later in its life. And of the two, the system was better at managing horizontal scrolling, hence Devil World and its awkward multi-directional scrolling. The screen scrolls pixel by pixel on the horizontal axis, but in big tile-sized chunks when you move vertically. I can't help but think Excitebike's design was informed at least in part by Miyamoto's experience working on Devil World. As his first NES project, Devil World would have presented a learning experience, a chance to get a sense of what works and what doesn't. At the same time, you can't help but see shades of Super Mario Bros. Here as well. Miyamoto's next major project would arrive about 9 months after Excitebike, and this racer clearly helped inform that work. The big idea behind Super Mario Bros. Was to take the characters of Mario Bros. And break them out of a single-screen design into a world that scrolled. Now here was Miyamoto iterating on that concept, developing a scrolling racer along with Super Mario Bros. Programmer Toshihiko Nakago. So, Excitebike, a racing game that scrolls left to right. It's at once a fresh and inventive take on racing, yet also a total throwback. Excitebike recalls old electromechanical horse racing games in which plastic horse jockeys sped along grooved tracks on a fixed vertical track, or pre-video racing games in which players would steer their car left and right to avoid obstacles while a road printed on paper rolls unfurled beneath them. It's slot racing as only a video game could depict it, allowing players to switch lanes at will and perform acrobatic stunts that allowed them to fly through the air and break contact with the track altogether. Crucially, Miyamoto decided not to go with the racing genre's standard cars here, but instead to use motocross racers as the players' avatars. This resulted in a game with much more personality than you'd have seen in a game centered on little metal boxes. Tiny racers run desperately back to their bikes when they take a tumble. That's totally adorable. However, the shift to bikes also opened up new approaches to gameplay too. Cars don't really lend themselves to dynamic, comical, gravity-defying action. Sure, you had exceptions like the bounding autos of Vic Tokai's Bump and Jump, and Jalico would add cars to the Mappy Mario Bros. Formula a year later with City Connection. But ultimately, car-centric racing games tended to focus on speed, avoidance, and handling. By putting players in control of dirt bikes instead, Excitebike still allowed those factors to come into play. But those realities of bikes no longer existed as the sole focus of the racers, but rather as complements to the elements that put Excite in the title: manic stunts and unpredictable track designs. Excitebike doesn't offer much by the way of game modes. Mode A presents a time trial, man versus track, while Mode B gives you a more standard competitive race, man versus man. Yet even Mode B doesn't do a proper race, with the player against a small set of racers. It's just a more complicated time trial, with your goal being to beat a target time rather than outperform the infinite array of competing racers who drift into view as you zoom along. Belying this simple array of play options though, Excitebike offers pleasantly sophisticated racing. In adopting a side-scrolling perspective, the game does away with the shape of the racetrack as a consideration. You never need to worry about cornering or hairpin turns, because speeding from left to right will eventually cause the track to loop for a second or third lap. There's a certain level of abstraction here, with a presumably circular track flattening out for its side view. Anyway, corners and turns would simply be a distraction that would overcomplicate the game. Excitebike already has plenty going on for the player to deal with, even though at a glance you're simply blazing from left to right as quickly as possible. The inclusion of bikes in the Excitebike mix causes a certain element of physics to come into play in the form of the player's balance. The tracks here may consist of an endless linear left-to-right loop, but the scenery includes hazards, obstacles, and convolutions aplenty. Unlike your typical 8-bit racetrack, Excitebike's courses aren't simply flat stretches of road. Excitebike challenges you with rugged dirt tracks where bumps, hills, and rough patches can potentially send you flying off your bike in an instant. While it's maybe a little generous to say Excitebike has a physics model in the modern sense, the game absolutely requires you to think about how you approach each track hazard. Your bike flies off ramps and embankments at an angle, and the faster you drive, the more unstable your cyclist becomes. If you don't pay attention to the angle of your cycle as you return to the ground, you'll go tumbling and lose precious time as your upended biker scurries slowly back to his ride. You can control the angle of your bike by pressing forward and backward with the D-pad. Holding left causes you to lean back and raise your front tire, while leaning forward will cause you to shift your weight forward and lower the bike's front half. Generally speaking, leaning forward as you land is likely to result in a bike disaster. Your motorcycle is far more stable on its rear tire, and as long as you don't pull back too far, you're generally safe performing wheelies. If you land on a downslope though, you'll want to pitch forward and lean into the angle of the ground. It's not a complicated setup, but it requires some practice. It also ties in with the game's other primary control consideration, your speed. The NES's face buttons each have a separate function in Excitebike. A gives your bike some gas, while B revs up your engine for extra speed. Hitting ramps at high speed becomes a crucial maneuver in Excitebike as it gives you added lift and often allows you to clear obstacles while airborne. Those bursts of speed come at a cost though. Holding down the B button runs the risk of causing your engine to overheat. Opening your throttle causes the engine to rev up and a temperature meter at the bottom of the screen to rise. If you let the meter max out, your bike will stall, which has the same effect as you falling off your ride. Handily, the temperature meter does emit a harsh noise when you're in the danger zone, so as long as you don't get greedy, it's not too hard to play it by ear and avoid ruining the race. Your engine heat bleeds off while you accelerate normally, and the meter resets entirely if you drive over one of the chevron patches on the track. So racing in Excitebike becomes a matter of balancing speed versus heat and memorizing where on each track you can cool down your bike. And really, that's about all there is to Excitebike. It's simple, but it offers just enough nuance to keep each race interesting. If the game has a flaw, it's that it shipped incomplete, in the US anyway. Excitebike features a third main menu option in addition to Mode A and Mode B, Design Mode. This was the first of several programmable games that shipped for NES and Famicom, jumping on the level editing trend that was all the rage at the time. Bill Budge's insanely influential Pinball Construction Kit had sparked an obsession with the idea of letting players create their own custom level layouts, and Nintendo entered the fray with Excitebike. The game's level editor isn't the most user-friendly thing in the world, but it's straightforward enough. Players are given a blank stretch of track and nearly 20 different level design components, which they can place to their heart's content. The editor breaks the track into horizontal segments, and you can't place more than a single item per segment. Otherwise, though, you basically have the same freedom of design as the dev team did, all the way down to determining the number of laps players have to complete. It's an interesting idea, but it has a problem. There's no way to save your work. Once you switch off the NES, all your creative course designs vanish into the ether. Strangely though, the game includes menu options for saving and loading, features that don't work here. The save feature takes you to a blue screen for a few moments before returning to the main menu, but attempting to load will basically end the game by sending you to the same blue screen from which there's no return. These inactive features seem strange, and the manual even mentions that they don't work, but that they're included in anticipation of future product developments. Well, in truth, future developments is something of a misstatement. The mechanism for saving custom tracks already existed by the time Excitebike launched in America. In fact, it existed by the time the game debuted in Japan. To record an Excitebike course, players needed to own a fairly elaborate setup of peripherals, the Famicom Basic set, which included both a full-size computer keyboard and a special cartridge, and the Famicom Data Recorder, a tape cassette drive specifically designed to interface with the Famicom Basic cartridge. By plugging the data recorder into the basic keyboard and the keyboard into the console, players could preserve their creations on cassette tape. It was quite a cumbersome setup, and it only worked on Famicom consoles. The basic keyboard plugged into the Famicom expansion port, which was situated on the front of the Japanese console and used a pinout not present on the NES. One of the main differences between the NES and the Famicom was that the latter featured hardwire controllers. The NES, on the other hand, had removable controllers, which gave American players more flexibility when it came to input choices. But it also introduced yet another regional incompatibility between the NES and Famicom. In Japan, Famicom owners had to rely on the system's expansion port for their peripherals, not only for controllers, but for add-ons like the basic keyboard. Replaced instead by a never-utilized covered port on the bottom of the console. Nintendo never figured out what to do with that port, but its presence and the wishy-washy stay tuned for future product developments in the Excitebike manual suggests the company was still open to bringing peripherals like the basic keyboard and data recorder to the US. After all, they had been key components of the proposed advanced video system version of the console. But that plan was eventually scuttled, and we never heard anything more of it. In practice, using the data recorder to save Excitebike stages almost seems like more trouble than it was worth. Besides the cumbersome setup of plugging a tape recorder into a keyboard peripheral, it also involved the sheer impracticality of the tape medium. From what I can tell, the data recorder lacked an onboard control device to allow the Famicom to send signals that would stop and start the tapes. In other words, players had to manually begin recording before attempting to save, and to queue up and play a save file segment manually after loading. Excitebike's save files amounted to a few seconds of white noise that would tell the Famicom to listen, followed by a short burst of data static, like running a modem. In theory, the static would feed track layout data back into the console. In practice, though, I couldn't get loading to work, repeatedly getting an error code that locked up the game system and forced a hard reset. Who knows why? Maybe it's something to do with my hardware configuration, or because I'm using the wrong type of cassettes, or it could simply be a matter of a 30-year-old analog accessory not working as intended due to the ravages of time. In any case, even Nintendo seemed to understand that the data recorder solution was not precisely optimal. No game ever used it for saving progress, and only a handful of releases besides Famicom Basic and Excitebike allowed players to store their custom creations on cassette. Wrecking Crew and Mach Rider from Nintendo, Lode Runner from Hudson, and ASCII's Castle Excellent, and supposedly Arkanoid 2 as well. Around the time the NES went national in America, of course, Nintendo launched the Famicom Disk System in Japan. That offered a far more elegant process for storing data on 3-inch diskettes, and fittingly, 2 years after that, Nintendo reworked Excitebike to take advantage of the new peripheral. That new version, Versus Excitebike, based in part on the arcade game Versus Excitebike, debuted in Japan in December of 1988, Almost exactly 4 years after the Famicom version of Excitebike's original debut, and well into the twilight years of the disk system. As such, it's remained something of an obscurity, which is a shame because it was by far the most comprehensive disk system overhaul of a cartridge game that ever saw release, even more so than Clu Clu Land D. For all intents and purposes, Versus Excitebike constituted a full sequel to the game, not just a remake. For starters, it featured a total overhaul of the track editing mode, where players could move freely forward and backward along the custom track and select course components from a convenient palette of icons. This made for a tremendously more user-friendly edit mode than in the original game with its line of letter codes, and you could immediately save up to 5 different layouts to disk. Among its other improvements, Versus Excitebike lived up to its name by allowing real head-to-head competitive split-screen play. The original Excitebike allowed players to race AI components, but not other humans, and Versus Excitebike rectified that by bringing a 2-player mode into the mix at last. The game also included what it termed Original Mode, a slightly deceptive name. Original Mode in Versus Excitebike basically amounted to the single-player game with more of a campaign-style interface and what appeared to be new track layouts. Nintendo's history of peripherals is basically a series of experiments to give form to creative ideas. With Excitebike, America received an incomplete version of the rough draft. The final revision wouldn't arrive here until last year, when the import of Versus Excitebike showed up without fanfare on Virtual Console. It's hard to feel too put out about Excitebike on NES though. Despite its nearly useless track editor, the main game offered such a refreshing take on racing that it would remain a fan favorite for years to come. Nintendo has gone back to the series well a few times, beginning on Super Famicom with a series of downloadable Mario-themed Excitebike courses for the Satellaview peripheral. Since the US never saw that peripheral either, we naturally never had the chance to play those games. However, we did get the excellent Excitebike 64, as well as 2009's largely forgotten Excitebike World Rally for WiiWare. The developer behind World Rally, Monster Games, also created 2 Wii spin-offs, Excite Truck and Excite Bots. We haven't really seen anything of the Excitebike franchise recently, but given its history, Miyamoto connection, and Nintendo fans' fond regard for it, it's pretty safe to say we haven't heard the last of it. As for the original Excitebike, it remains a landmark NES classic, and it's a good time even if you're not much for racing. But ultimately, you probably shouldn't bother with the NES game. If you're going to play Excitebike, do it right and grab the sequel Versus Excitebike on Virtual Console. It's not that the original game isn't good, the update is just that much better. Next time on Good Intentions, Jackie Chan makes his NES debut?